Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. You know, in politics, when reason and emotion collide, emotion invariably wins. That means elections are decided by how the voters respond to the most powerful provocations or influences or images, and yes, probably even court cases. So, for a more dispassionate view about election outcomes in the U.S. state of mind, Clifford Young, president of polling and societal trends at Ipsos in Washington, aka Crazy Town. He's also a professor teaching courses like predicting elections and public opinion as policy drivers. So, Clifford, it's great to see you again. A lot has happened since we last spoke. So, we'll talk about some of those things. But I was in New York on the weekend. I had a drink. I had two friends, brought them together. One is a raging Republican, one is a raging Democrat. Neither one of them like their candidates very much, what their party is offering. As soon as one criticized the other, they became totally defensive. The Republicans said, you know, the whole court case was a setup. It was lawfare. The gag order was ridiculous. The Democrat who had just been talking about the troubling mental acuity or lack thereof of the president, all of a sudden became, this is all about the future of democracy. Oh my God, what is going on?
Well, it's great to be here, right? From DC,
Yeah, nice
Crazy
to see
Town.
you.
We're in Crazy Town. That is America today.
Yeah.
We live in our bubbles and see the world in very, very different ways, right? I mean, you had two friends in New York
Yeah.
City, that saw the world in starkly different manners. And that's what we see in the polling. It replicates itself over and over again. And if we look kind of more specifically at what just happened, obviously, you have the verdict,
Yeah.
and Trump was found guilty. And what do we find with the polling? We find the same sort of partisan break. A super majority of Republicans, 83% in our last poll, see the decision as politically motivated, whereas only about 10 to 12% of Democrats think the same. So again, it's just sort of repeating the same polarization that we've had here in the United States over the last decade.
Because there were some interesting things, like I watch all of the networks so that I can sort of balance it out a little bit in my own brain. But even the CNN analyst acknowledged that there was kind of a contortion of the law. And I also saw from a lot of very rich, big Republican donors, we don't like him. We supported Nikki Haley, like whatever it was. But because of the trial, because of the gag order, they said, no, we're back in. We're writing the checks. But you're saying that was already in the pool. It doesn't really represent a change.
No, our polling shows that there really wasn't any change. If you look at before and after, the only notable difference is in the energy with the Republican Party.
Yeah.
That pumped them up, that mobilized them, and indeed, and you mentioned this at the beginning, that we're living in an America today where the vast majority of Americans believe the system is broken. It no longer works for people like them.
Right.
And this court case and the verdict is just a proof point of that. On the right, it's basically he was unfairly and unjustly convicted. And on the left, we have to do that to save democracy. Democracy from whom? From Trump. And so again, it just reinforces our systemic distrust right now in the United States.
I read a number the other day. It was like almost 2/3 of people saying they are already worn out. Like it's June. There's a way to go. But because they've been so inundated, I mean, it was 24 hours a day, right? So, and now Biden is starting to go out there a bit on the campaign. But does everybody always say that at this time about the elections? Like, just, I've made up my mind, don't talk to me anymore.
Yeah, for the most part, people aren't paying attention. I mean, I think
Yeah.
that most Americans are worried about making ends meet, taking their kids to school, having a good job, those sorts of more bread and butter issues and concerns. But yeah, I mean, Trump is always good for a good earned media spot, right? And so when we're focused on him, there's a lot of attention, a lot of energy. I wouldn't say necessarily the population is exhausted at this point, but definitely we have a lot of months to go before the thing's decided. And indeed, it's even starting earlier than normal, right? Because we have our
Yeah.
debate, or the
Yeah.
first debate in June, which is atypical. It's unprecedented. Obviously, it's a little bit of desperation on Biden's part,
Yeah.
but we're anticipating the season, and so it's beginning obviously early.
So what do you feel? I mean, we have this age-old debate, this country, your country, everywhere else. And sometimes debates really are significant. There's a moment where it changes people's views or perspectives. What do you think about this one? The first one seems to be, as you say, because of the timing and because of the circumstances, it could be really important.
Yeah, typically debates are not important. The empirical evidence shows that they don't really have an effect, but this one is significant. This is we have a sitting president in Biden that's winged, that's weak from a numeric standpoint, and wants to go out there and prove that he is still, the person and the person to go to, the champion on the left. There's a lot of questions about obviously his cognitive acuity.
Yeah.
I think he wants to, put those to rest if he can. And he was the one, at least that's my interpretation in the conversations I've had on this side. It was really the Biden camp that pushed for this early debate to show America, really wanting to show America that he's still in the game.
I mean, his interviews in the last, there's not that many, but the one I think it was with Time, and he's kind of doing this, attempting to do this fighter thing, like, I can take you on, like, is that gunslinger thing really going to work?
Maybe on the margins, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I think once again, we have to really understand that for the most part, people are going to go out and vote for Biden, not because of Biden, but because they don't want Trump. And so that sort of more truculent sort of positioning will work with that anti-Trump vote. But ultimately, the election is going to be won by bringing back into the fold certain constituency groups that have left it because of inflation. So younger Americans, Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, and less affluent Americans, all a part of the 2020 Biden coalition, have really stepped aside as they've had problems making ends meet.
It is kind of back to the old Carville saying, it's the economy, stupid. Everybody's saying it's the I word. No, not Israel, inflation.
Yeah, it is not Israel. That's a false positive, let's say. Maybe it could have some sort of impact in a place like Michigan, but really, when you put the economy, or more specifically inflation, against Gaza, inflation wins out across all demographics. That's really Biden's problem. And we have to understand the sort of inertial effects of inflation. It messes up household finances. It basically, creates perception, even if it doesn't exist today, that's difficult to make ends meet. And it takes time to work out. More time typically than an improvement in the economy has an impact, let's say, on unemployment, for instance.
This whole issue, and there's so much about it. Of course, there's all the Thomas Frank books that he's written over the the limousine liberals, and that people are too busy trying to earn a living to listen to TED Talks or vacation, in Martha's Vineyard, that kind of stuff. And there was another book just out, this Batya Unger Sargon, Second Class: How Elites Betrayed America's Working Men and Women. And she really, as from the point of view of a Democrat, really breaks down how the Democrats have lost that connection with the blue collar, with the working people in the country, because they've embraced that limousine liberal kind of stuff. What are you seeing there?
Yeah, I would, I think we're seeing the same thing in the polling. I don't know if any one group of elites is any better or worse than another one at understanding the plight of the average person. But what we're seeing specifically today is that the Democrats and the Democratic elite have really misread the average American who's having a problem making ends meet, where inflation is a real problem. Indeed, a lot of the argument, the talking points on the Democratic side have been that this is sort of all imaginary, right? You're imagining these sorts of things.
Yeah,
It's
the
not
economy's
real.
great. You just don't feel it yet. Yeah.
Yeah, the inflation rates are coming down. But by the way, no one really understands what an inflation rate is. But they do understand that they're paying $50 more than last year for basic foodstuffs, and they can't make ends meet at the end of the month. And so it's really difficult to sell from Biden's standpoint to sell that he's done so much for them from an economic standpoint when they're really not feeling it. So from that perspective, from that frame, yes, there's a serious disconnect between the Democratic elite and the average person today.
I mean, because the other side that is so puzzling to look at from outside the country is how, and this was the question 2016, how does millionaire, billionaire, whatever the number is accurately, Donald Trump become the spokesperson of the poor and the downtrodden and the working man? Like, how does that connection form?
Yeah, but it's not about the intrinsic attributes of Donald Trump that matter. It's that he's able to frame it in the way that makes sense to people. And I would go as far as saying he's one of our most, brilliant political communicators of the last half century. And this is globally, not just in the United States, in terms of what I've seen. Maybe Lula in Brazil is an equivalent in his ability to talk, about the common man, sort of a common person's sort of plight day to day. I think that Trump is brilliant at that.
Yeah.
He's been able to couch that in from a cultural frame as well. We're losing our country, not economically speaking, but from a cultural standpoint, it's changing. The America that was no longer is and will not be unless we do something. It's a brilliant framing and it's understanding of the common plight of the average person.
So, if now the sentencing comes in July, just before the convention, I got a sense watching his interview the other day with Fox that, it was almost like bring it on. If he has to do the convention on Zoom from jail, that's just gonna really help that framing and allow him to carry on with his narrative on this that just seem to be making him more popular.
Yeah, I mean, once again, as I was mentioning, in a general sense, there's the widespread belief that the system is broken.
Yeah,
that it's rigged against the common person. And this will that imagery will just reinforce this belief, and it will reinforce the fact that Trump is their champion.
Yeah.
He's there to channel that grievance that they've been left behind, they've been left out, and see what the elites are doing. They're going after our champion. They're going after our man. We need to support him. I think it will, if it happens, it will be from Trump's standpoint a brilliant win that will just reinforce his connection to his base. Whether he wins the election or not, based on that's another question. But definitely, it's powerful in terms of imagery.
Carville was saying again the other day, what the Democrats need to do is campaign against MAGA, not against Trump, because Trump is more popular than his base is, and keep making the democracy argument or they are scary people argument, and there will be more January 6th argument, as opposed to Trump's a bad person and not fit to be president because actually people saw him as one.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree with that. I think the democracy argument plays much more to the Democratic base, and it's a way to mobilize them and ensure that they show up. Because this is going to be about a turnout election. It might mean mobilizing in part independents, that slice that leans more Democratic. What they really need, they're not going to convince a hardcore Republican, a hardcore MAGA person to not show up on election day. Now, maybe there's some sort of effect on the margins with moderates, especially moderate women, Republican in suburban areas. But really, at the end of the day, there is this need, and we've got to sort of emphasize this several times. There's this need to sort of connect with that sort of the core constituency that's been affected by inflation.
A couple of things. How I mean, I think goes without saying, the VP pick by Trump is going to be pretty key in terms of how he presents himself. I mean, can't imagine in a million years it would be Nikki Haley, but that would give moderates a whole different way in. What do you think the strategy is around that?
Yeah. Well, first, I don't. I VP picks typically don't play at the public opinion level. They're always much more important for elites, for donors.
Yeah,
The elite adjacent sort of groups that support sort of campaigns and efforts like that. We have to understand that. Obviously, just from optically speaking, it would be nice to bring in someone a little bit more moderate. Maybe you sort of you could play kind of both sides of the fence, but but at the end of the day, this is all about Trump. It's the Trump show, and then
yeah.
ultimately it's going to be almost immaterial who he brings in for VP.
But is he more likely to go for a mini-me, like somebody who's just going to be there to reflect the arguments, a Marco Rubio, or like who do you think the leading contenders are at this point? Through
Yeah,
the
I don't like
yeah,
on that one. I'm not quite sure, but just
yeah,
taking a stab, sort of, reading Trump, and we've been reading him
yeah,
for since 2015 a bit, or looking at him and reflecting on him. I think you'll want someone more like him than not.
yeah,
I don't think this rational reflection of I need a more moderate individual there, and that will complete my ticket, and I'll be able to bring in that sort of those individuals on the margins. I don't see him doing that. That probably is the best play in theory. I think he'll probably double down on sort of people
yeah.
like him.
Yeah, that's certainly what it looks like. Is he betting? And I guess is everybody betting? There's the sense that we've kind of come to we're having our fill on all of this liberal virtue signaling and the DEI and all of that, that the pendulum is kind of swinging back a little bit. Is that for real?
Well, I mean, he represents that reaction, but it isn't something that's happening today.
Okay.
He represented that reaction in 2015 and 16 as well.
Yeah.
And so yes, it's happening today, and it's part of the culture war, and it's part of this sort of nativist backlash. And indeed, if you peel away the onion on nativism, it's really about defining who is and who is not an American. It's a definitional debate. Maybe people wouldn't frame it as such, but when we look at the data, that's what it is. And so yes, and so that's all sort of enveloped inside of DEI, ESG, all these sorts of trends, societal trends, social
Yeah.
trends that we're seeing are all sort of enveloped inside this broader culture war.
And Biden really felt he had to do something on the border, despite all the politics around it.
But it's out of control, right? I mean,
Yeah.
like if you look at the numbers,
No, it's
he has
totally.
lost control of the
Yeah.
border. Now, immigration is not the number one issue. If immigration were the number one issue, Donald Trump would be a shoo-in.
Right.
It's not the number one issue. It's kind of a race between threats to democracy versus the economy at this point. But definitely, immigration is an Achilles heel. It's a
Yeah.
danger. It's something that Trump won on in 2016 and could very well win on this year if things don't settle down.
And if you can tie the border issue and the out of control issue and connect that with crime, then that starts to connect with suburban women and even younger people in a way. Everybody's a bit afraid.
Yeah, and so that's exactly what Republicans are trying to do now. That's like part of their messaging, right? Is to link the two. To what extent that will be the primary message of a campaign. I think it will be some sort of toggle between immigration and obviously the economy. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's definitely a strategy, and a strategy that makes sense.
But that's also the thing, because if the Democrats are selling the economy, which they're trying to do, which is things are better, you're just not feeling it yet, but it's coming and we've done all the right things. When people are worried about whether there's food on the table or mortgage payments met, then some of this other stuff, including even the broad environmental issues, seem to go down a bit in people's minds. Like, we'll worry about that once the kids are fed.
Yeah, without a doubt. So the economy always dominates the agenda, whether it's number one or whether it's 10, right? Because
Yeah.
when it's weak, other issues pop up. And when it's strong, it is the primary issue. And what we have today is a changing agenda. We have an economy that's improving, though we have this inertial effect of inflation that affects specific groups, constituency groups. Um, but it's waning the economy. Threats to democracy has been over the last few waves the number one issue for us at Ipsos. That's a democratic issue that's important for Biden and his camp. But they're competing against each other. That is, the economy and threats to democracy are sort of like one and two. Obviously, the economy, no matter what Biden says about it, the economy is really a Republican issue. It's a Trump issue, and Biden really wants it to go away to the extent that it can.
Got to ask because I forgot the RFK factor. Is it one? Who does he help? Who does he hurt? Robert Kennedy Jr. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, first and foremost, I think he suggests that there's a chunk of Americans that don't like either choice, like your friends.
Yes.
In New York this weekend, right? If they had a choice, they'd have someone else, maybe not
Yep.
RFK, but someone else. And that's maybe 15% of the population. He tends to be center right a little bit. In theory, he should hurt Trump more than Biden, but Biden would have to take those, let's say, RFK orphans and bring them into the fold. And so that's kind of where we are. We have to understand that third-party candidates in the United States tend to fizzle out over the course of the electoral cycle. As individuals, like, think about their vote, and am I going to really throw my vote away with RFK, or I'm going to vote for Biden, or am I going to really throw it away? I'm going to vote for Trump. And so that vote typically fizzles a bit, tapers off. A lot of them don't vote. And so right now, I would say we just don't know. But I mean, it is significant that he has so many votes.
The on the Democratic side, what do you, if anything, find in your polling about the issue of the president's competency? We see good days like the State of the Union, where he was able to, kind of succeed. And yes, he had a teleprompter and all of that. And then you see the other days where there's a lot of confusion. Is that coming? Are you seeing that move anywhere, which is we feel sorry for this, or it's really serious and we can't do this? Like, where does it play?
That's interesting. So our polling suggests that Americans think both are too old.
Yeah.
But Biden has more of a problem than Trump. So that's and that's pretty constant, been pretty constant over the last 6 months or so. But when push comes to shove, whether Biden is 80 years old or 800 years old, the anti-Trump voters are going to vote for him because they don't want Trump. And so that's ultimately, we believe, the decision calculus that's going on. Yeah, we would rather have another choice. We don't. We definitely don't want Trump. We're going to vote for Biden no matter what happens. So that's basically the assessment today.
And they don't really like the vice president, Kamala Harris. I mean, she's not helping him in the sense of if you hate Trump and you're going to vote Democratic one way or the other, then you've got to hope that Biden has some kind of miraculous comeback so it doesn't go to the second tier.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, she's a non-entity from a public opinion standpoint. Vice presidents typically are non-entities when it comes to public opinion. They don't have a very strong expression from a public standpoint. She has an especially weak one. She has had a weak one over time. And low name recognition, not very good favorability. But I don't believe, once again, that's going to play in at all to people's thinking. A person's not going to decide not to vote for Biden because of Kamala Harris. It's just not going to happen. Again, they're anti-Trump voters. About 25% of the population are anti-Trump voters, and they're going to vote for him no matter what. They just hope that he gets the election day. We're there. He gets there, gets over the line, and whatever happens after that happens. But they do not want Trump in the White House.
Yeah. So, do you put any stock at all in these theories that somehow, if there's an incident, let's say, that where the incident helps Trump, like if he gets put in jail, then that helps him. That creates the whole. But if Biden has a serious stumble, either literally or figuratively, before their convention, that somehow the Democrats would rise up and put, who knows, Gavin Newsom, somebody in the window. Do you think there's serious consideration of an alternative underway just because of the fear of something might happen?
There's been a lot of talk here in the Beltway, here in DC, about that. It was most intense last year, at the end of last year. But that won't get Democrats anywhere. Their best chance is with Biden. He's a sitting incumbent. An incumbent has an advantage by our sort of database on elections, about a threefold advantage over a successor. It would most probably be suicide to have someone else there. That's my analytic take on things. Would Democrats, rally around an alternative if something happened? Maybe, but it would not be in their best interest.
Yeah. So it's 3-1 is what you're saying. Like that's a powerful figure.
It's like this. I'll give you the exact data point, which is a cool one. At 40% of approval rating, a sitting president like Biden has a 55% chance of winning. A successor at 40% approval rating has a 6% chance of winning.
Wow.
Yeah. So in other words, he's right at that tipping point. Biden is. He'd want to be a little bit higher. He wants to be a little bit higher in terms of approval ratings, but any sort of alternative would have a huge uphill battle to even get to a reasonable place to be competitive.
I mean, this is a bizarre situation where you really have two back-to-back sitting presidents in a race, because then it is hard to handicap those numbers, because some of that applies to Trump, obviously, too, which is people who see him as an incumbent recently.
Yeah, true, but without a doubt. And so we had the same sort of situation in Brazil, 2022, with Bolsonaro and Lula. Lula was in jail. Trump might go to jail. I mean, it's very similar. And at the end of the day, Bolsonaro lost, a sitting incumbent lost, and they had an improving economy that almost got them across their finish line, but not quite. And I think we're in a very analogous situation. Whether Biden gets across the finish line or not is another question, but it will be a nail biter.
Yeah, and I was going to ask about that because you guys, Ipsos does a lot of work internationally, and there's a lot of elections this year. We're in the middle of some of them. I mean, we just saw Mexico electing a woman, which we're not really sure it represents change from the predecessor because of how connected they are. UK. Probably going to be a change there. Scottish guy just thrown out. What's the mood? What are you seeing as you look at, India, Modi, looked like he was in, and now he's lost the majority take.
Yeah, that's a great question. So what do we know at Ipsos? Obviously, we're tracking these elections around the world. We're in 90 countries, and a big chunk of what's going on, we're covering it. We know in a general sense, just like in the United States, that a supermajority of global citizens believe the system is broken, believe that parties and politicians don't care about the average person, that the system is rigged, and therefore you need a strong leader to, even if they have to break the rules, to take the country back. Those exact phrasing of our questions, and we see this notion that this anti-system, anti-establishment notion or sentiment is everywhere. Obviously, it manifests itself in different ways in different places. So in the United States, we have the anti-establishment candidate in Trump and the establishment candidate in Biden, right? In India, Modi, or in Mexico, or in Indonesia, you had anti-system candidates that all won in highly anti-system places, right? The UK is strange because you have two establishment parties going at it. The party in power is going to be kicked out, obviously, but you see a lot of cracks around the edges. The same thing with same thing with Canada. So once again, it takes on different flavors in different places, but overall, what we can say is that the establishment is under pressure,
regardless of whether that's left
regardless of regardless of how it ultimately manifests itself
right
in outcomes. The systems themselves are highly questioned at this point. We have widespread systemic distrust.
So you're sitting in Washington. So now I'm going to ask you to look back and spend a minute on this country, because we're in the anticipatory mode, right? Usually we don't have this long a runway, and in the end we might not, but we're in a pretty long runway. The conservatives are leaps and bounds ahead, but things happen, stuff happens, and that can change. What's your read on what's going on here?
I think it's a very strong change election. And I think all the data that I've seen so far suggests that Canadians are fed up with the way things are. It's a very typical cyclical sort of back and forth yin and yang, electoral yin and yang. You know, throw the bums out, more of the same. Throw the bums out, more of the same. That's how I see it. Now that said, you have cracks on the edges, just like in the UK. Maybe the UK more so. So you have issues of immigration, which is one of the primary drivers in the West of this anti-establishment perspective, right? And you have that on the edge. And I don't know how much it actually plays out in the election itself, but this sort of changing composition of populations have profound sort of political sort of implications long term. So I don't think Canada is any different from the rest of the world. But it probably is a little bit more sort of is more evolutionary than revolutionary, right? The change.
Yeah, it's interesting because it does seem like the playbooks are the same in a way. You know, abortion is not, you know, it doesn't change in this country the way you got, the system is totally different. But now, because that's an issue that's working in the US, we're talking about it here. We're talking about gun control. Again, we do have border issues. This has been a country built by immigrants, obviously, but again, the numbers are so significant that we've got, I was reading something this morning that, 60% of the pressure in the housing market and all of that is coming from newcomers, whether legal or illegal to whatever extent. And so people are reacting to it, where that's never really been a big issue in Canadian elections before.
Yeah, but I think that Canada is following if not global trend, a Western trend.
Yeah,
where we have changing demographics. We have populations that are getting older. Yeah. We have populations that are less white. We have populations with higher levels of foreign born. And these all put sort of pressure, both economic and cultural, on the places on the places of origin, right? And whether that changes the electoral dynamic, like in the U.S., where that becomes the issue, right? What is America? Because at the end of the day, if you peel away the onion, we're having a debate about what America is, right? But in a place like the UK and Canada, maybe you're not having that debate exactly yet. But these sort of
starting.
But it's starting. But these social changes are going on, and I think these social changes, whether it be here or in Canada or in Europe, are the sort of changes that are going to be around for the rest of our lives, and will be the critical points of debate and contention in the near term.
Your colleague from Canada, Daryl Bricker, who we're going to be talking to in a couple of weeks, has been highlighting this through a book and then through a lot of the work you guys are doing, but that we got a population crunch, in the sense that in the Western world, people are not having kids. And we've got all of these pressures for migration from troubled countries everywhere. And that this is just going to profoundly change the face, the values, the ethics, the standards, the everything about the countries that we know them. So that debate about what's a Canadian or what's an American becomes very real.
Yeah, obviously Gerald and I talk all the time, and
Yeah.
I think that a lot of the different things we write separately. We actually sort of validate, against what the other one's done. But listen, like it's sequence, because one thing is an old population, which means one thing. I think in the near term, we're talking about population compositional changes. So, like, as I said before, going from a majority white to a minority white country. That's the US, but that's the trend in most of the West, right? Because you have differential fertility rates, you have migration, we have migration in to these countries of people of different sort of ethnic origins, et cetera. And it like challenges the culture. And indeed, like as I was saying before, really when you peel away the onion, it's really a cultural a debate that we're having here in the United States. It's about who is a real American? Who is it, right? And what we find is, those that are more nativist have one definition, much more restrictive, much higher bar. Those that are non-nativists in the United States have a much more diffuse, diverse, lower bar in terms of what it all is, and that's in my mind, that's where the political debate's going to sort of revolve around in all of these countries in the next decades ahead.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Really, really great to talk to you again, Cliff. Thank you very much for taking this time and focusing, giving us the lens through which to see this. Cliff Young, president of Polling and Societal Trends. No kidding. Just
yeah, right. I capture that.
Exactly. Thanks again. We'll talk soon sometime as this election thing progresses. We'll call you back and say, okay, now what?
Exactly.
All right. Thanks again. That's it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. We'll see you all again soon, too.